Okay, cool. So, all right. So, everyone, welcome to the last workshop this season of Lithuanian Schools Debating League. I'll be the host of this workshop, and the workshop is going to be on postcolonialism, decoloniality, and indigeneity. So, just a little note on the background. That's sort of my background. So, I did my academic background is in anthropology. Specifically, I did master's in visual anthropology. But the subject of the matter I dealt with was postcolonialism. So it's something that I hold dear to my heart. It's also something that we've seen debaters struggle over and over again, especially with the characterizations. Whenever we set a motion, especially if it's something on indigeneity. So hopefully this workshop sort of enlightens you a little bit more on the subject and lets you to be more precise on it. In general, this workshop is going to be in three parts. Firstly, we'll delve into the concepts of postcolonialism, decoloniality, indigeneity, and all the related ones. So we're clear on that. Secondly, we'll go into some theories, thinkers, and concepts that relate to these big ideas. So it's going to be more as of like a reference guide for you to go into those ideas if you find those interesting, inspiring, and so on and so forth. And lastly, in the third part, we'll go over some motions set either around postcolonialism or around indigeneity, and we'll have a talk about that. It's this workshop is going to be somewhat dense, theoretically, and somewhat advanced. So if at any point you feel kind of lost, please write in the comment section. Ludas will let me know, and we'll be able to address those questions of yours. Okay, so firstly, we need to, of course, answer the question, what is postcolonialism, right? So there's firstly this distinction when it's written with a hyphen and when it's not written with a hyphen, right? So when there's a hyphen, please note that it usually refers to a period after any formerly colonized country took its official independence, right? If it's not a hyphen, then it rather refers to a more theoretical network of ideas and notions relating to the state of post-hyphen colonialism, right? So post-colonialism is sort of a wide variety of ideas, really. That firstly is a critical academic study of the cultural, political, and economic legacy of colonialism and imperialism. We'll go into those terms a little bit deeper after. Please note the word critical. It means it does evolve from critical theory in the 70s and 80s. So it does take a lot of inspiration from literary theory and all of that. So basically, postcolonialism studies effects and results of colonialism and imperialism. So it means it addresses the matters that constitutes the postcolonial identity of a decolonized people, of decolonized peoples, right? If you look at it from a slightly more ideological point of view, that is something that sometimes attracts critique as a field of study. It is a counter-ideology that deconstructs, critiques, excludes, and negates writing, sometimes, usually, historic writing from Western-centric viewpoints and concentrates on writing from colonized or formerly colonized peoples or their viewpoint. That means that it aims to address disempowered or historically disempowered peoples and address the ways in which colonialists used to perceive, understand, and know the world, right? So sort of like a Western-centric notions of the reality of the vast majority of the world population. Really, postcolonialism, then we can say, refers to the end of colonialism, right? It comes after colonialism by establishing these intellectual spaces for the other or a subaltern. We'll go into these terms later on a little bit too, to speak for themselves and in their own voices. So it's really a form of a counter-storytelling and producing cultural discourses on philosophy, language, society, and economy, balancing this binary power relationship between the colonized and the colonist. So really, because postcolonialism really evolves as a critique of the effects of two sort of historic activities, let's call them that, right? Imperialism and colonialism. We should answer the question, what are those, right? We see these terms kind of get conflated quite a bit, even though they have a rather different meaning, and if we go to the nuances, there are even more of those, right? So when we speak about imperialism, we talk about a dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant territory, right? So really, usually imperialism refers to a central expansionist policy that is executed through ideological and financial reasons. Whereas colonialism is rather implanting of settlements on a distant territory. That is development of settlement or commercial intentions, and also implies a sort of geographic separation. Therefore, in most of the thinking and writing, things like imperialist, Russian, Chinese, or Ottoman expansion is not referred to as colonialism, as in those peoples too are not referred to colonized people. There is sometimes this sort of wish for Eastern Europeans, right, to call themselves colonized peoples. I would highly advise against that. That is grossly inaccurate and usually serves just as a political tool to sort of claim a symmetrical victimhood, even though I fear that there is not such symmetry there, right? So really, if we simplify these terms, imperialism really answers the question, how to conquer an entity, a polity, state, people, whatever. And colonialism rather refers to the question of how to preserve and dominate that conquered territory. So really, colonialism is rather the consequence of imperialism and continuous part of the project. So really, when we speak about imperialism, so to say, we can refer to colonialism as being part of that ideology and part of that project. However, when we talk about colonialism, that doesn't necessarily describe all the things imperialist, right? As there is this sort of a sub-relationship between two, when imperialism is somewhat wider and broader than colonialism, i.e. like a latter stage for it. However, sometimes imperialism does not evolve into colonialism, right? So if, say, it doesn't meet the criteria of that geographic separation, of that development of settlement, extractivism, and so on, it's usually then not colonialism. There's, however, a very important similarity between the two, right? Because both of them focus on creation and suppression of the other, or the creation, firstly, right, of the other. That is, there is this ideological, social, cultural, psychological creation of the subject in order to justify your dominance over that subject, right? And so within post-colonial thinking, post-colonial theory, we call that project the othering, right? Where the other is construed with its signifiers that we call the otherness. So it is a term that is borrowed from psychoanalysis, specifically from Lacan. Lacan takes them from Hegel. It has quite a long history, so to say, but rather first post-colonial thinkers will go into them and into their ideas, sort of borrowed it from there and applied it to this context of post-colonial reality. Well, back in the day, it was still colonial reality because the first post-colonial thinkers were still living in colonial times, right? Okay. Then, of course, there's a question of all the colonialisms, so to say, right? Because there's quite a few, and there's quite a few from around. So when we talk about colonization, we say the word colonization, we usually talk about the system that is centered around the commodification of both the people and the resources that are being dominated, right? So it looks something like enslavement of indigenous populations usually. So historically, we can refer to it as, for example, when we speak about the primary stages of Spanish colonialism in the Americas, that is when the first colonizers came, for example, I don't know, into the Caribbean, right? What they did, they firstly enslaved the indigenous Taino populations. In Colombia, it was the indigenous Kipcha populations, and used those for the labor, for the extraction of the resources, to take those resources, right, as commodities and bring those back for manufacturing back to their home countries. There's also this term that is called settler colonialism that is somewhat different. So settler colonialism refers to a policy where evacuation and extractivism is at the center. It doesn't necessarily mean that colonization without settler doesn't talk about extractivism, but there's more pressure on it under settler colonialism. So what it looks like is usually it looks like displacement, that is moving the population out of their indigenous territory, so to say. Sometimes it means genociding that population, and it usually means importing foreign laborers, i.e. settlers, who come in then and do the work. So for example, Boers in South Africa, the Spanish in Canary Islands, Israelis in Palestine are settlers, i.e. they can be viewed as, foreign labor populations brought in by the nation-building elites to sort of execute that extractivist policy there, right? Hence settler colonialism. What is important to note here that there's a lot of times where colonialism veers into settler colonialism. So that usually happens when colonists deplete the local populations through forced labor, through enslavement, and then because there's a lack of basically human resources to pursue that extractivist project, they bring in a sort of the labor population, right? So in the case of the Caribbean, after the Taino population was depleted, right, they started bringing in enslaved people from Africa, but also Spanish started to migrate into those parts as well. Because of different historic reasons, right, when there is lack of labor shortages, then, for example, they started mass integration or mass introduction of Chinese laborers too, or in cases of minor Antilles in the Caribbean, people from the Indian subcontinent. So basically, yeah, just note that that can happen a lot, and just be mindful of those differences, right? There's also this term neocolonialism. Neocolonialism refers to the continuation or imposition of dominance by a state, that is usually a former colonial power, over another nominally or not independent state. That is usually a former colony. So really, neocolonialism is a continuation of the imperialist project. Also, Ludas is telling me that if at any point you get confused about anything I'm talking about, we can let you speak on stage if you want, and I'll explain these things to more depth or to more clarity. Just please note if you want me to go deeper into one thing or another. Okay. So neocolonialism is usually framed as the continuation of imperialist project. There is this sort of historic continuation between the colonizer and the colonized implied. But it's not necessary, right? Because we sometimes talk about neocolonialism under, for example, in cases of US meddling in countries that they have never have colonized, right? So specifically in Latin America, we sometimes talk about American neocolonialism of, say, Chile or Peru or Bolivia, especially over the resources there. It is not necessarily the most precise way to frame it, But just for the sake of having a conversation that both sides can understand, it's okay. Just if you want to be more precise, you shouldn't use that sort of language to describe those things. Then there's this concept following on of decolonization, and that refers to the undoing of colonialism. So really, decolonization, so undoing of colonialism, right, is really a setup for neocolonialism or extension of imperialism. So really, when we talk about decolonization, we can also talk about its deconstructive effect on neocolonialism or imperialism, or of course, colonialism abroad. It is not only nominal, that is, it is not only a political struggle or an economic struggle, that is, doesn't necessarily mean just getting your independence, as it was the case in the Spanish Americas in the beginning of the 19th century or Africa in the mid 20th century, but is really, it really refers to ontological and epistemic decolonization, right? So it's not really only, and really also, it's not only about reclaiming your nominal independence, right? Or economic sovereignty, or your social autonomy. It is really about the ways in which you can produce your own knowledge and your own value systems and prioritize those and have the dominion to enforce those in your territory. That, of course, creates a lot of problems in contemporary debates, right? But it is really what it means. So it's really about the struggle against coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge. That is, decolonization project is really about decolonizing symbology, practice, research, creativity, narratives. That is, it is really allowing those people to organize their own realities in the way they wish, without the imposition of sort of knowledge or value systems that came from the West. Now, another term that is in the title of this workshop is decoloniality, and that is somewhat different from decolonization. It comes firstly from the Spanish academia and Spanish thinking. Therefore, there's a subtitle, Decolonialidad. So really, decoloniality, given that postcolonialism deals with the identitarian effects of colonialism on people that have been colonized before, it is a stance or approach that seeks to rediscover, revalidate, and restore indigenous knowledge, cultural values, and social and economic structures that have been displaced or suppressed by colonialism, right? So these are those ontological and epistemic things I was talking about, right? So it's not only about, say, establishing your own independent country or having sovereignty over it. It's also about restoring what's been replaced through 4 or 5 or whatever, how many centuries of dominating sort of ideological narratives imposed on those people by the colonial powers, by the colonized. So really, it aims to decenter and dismantle those colonial attitudes and power structures that through that colonization time have become very much embedded into the fabric of those societies, those peoples, right? So what decoloniality talks about is about delinking this Eurocentric knowledge, right? Epistemology. Epistemology refers to the ways in how we construct knowledge, that is, how we come to know things and how we come to hold some things as truth, or how then we organize that truth according to the criteria that we think is important for us as a society. So it allows for other forms of existence of Earth. So it is also a sort of, so to say, an act of civil disobedience. That is an act of epistemic disobedience. When you reject, for example, Western scientism, right? So the ways in which, for example, Western scientific method is held to claim the truth or the best way of organizing human realities, and sort of also embrace more indigenous matrilineal mythical knowledges. So it looks like something, for example, as midwifery, as folk medicine versus Western medicine. It looks something like agroforestry versus a more resource extractivist policies dictated by the Western scientific method that informs the economic workings of the capitalist system. It looks like sovereign food systems, just knowing how to reproduce food through time, that, for example, and how it relates to things like seed sovereignty, right? And you've probably heard quite a few debates happening right now about these huge companies like Monsanto, blah, 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 and so on, using fertilizers and GMOs, and how that is imposed on those sort of, the sort of Western scientific method is sort of imposed on those sort of type of knowledge systems that are seen as archaic, as not efficient, basically as not serving the global capitalist goal. I hope that is clear so far. Ludas hasn't noted anything to me, so I'll keep going. The point of clarification. Yeah, you may raise points of clarifications now. Okay, if not, we can move on, and I think that's sort of the last big theory bit here. Clarify these terms for you. So indigeneity, indigenism, and indigenismo. Three terms that are somewhat different. So when we talk about indigeneity, we talk about the quality of a person's own group's identity that links them to specific places with knowledge and respect for the original ways, right? So within this definition, you can immediately sense a sort of inclusion of whitened people. That is, it doesn't necessarily include people that are ethnically indigenous. That is, according to the Western sense of ethnicity, they have some heritage of indigenous blood. It also links to the ways in which you claim your own identity through both the rejection of the colonial Western practices and knowledge systems and embracing those sort of pre-colonial original ways of thinking, knowledge, and being. So an example of this, of whitening, right, or something that in Spanish they refer to like gente blanqueada, right? It doesn't necessarily mean white people, it means whitened people. Because, race is a political category. We'll go into that a little bit later on. So malinchismo is this type of cultural cringe. If you don't know what cultural cringe is a term we use to refer to people who sort of feel inferior about their own culture. That is, they have a sort of fetish for everything foreign. So it is also a type of this national self-hatred. And it comes from this legend in Mexico, how when Cortés came and all the first generation of colonizers came to Mexico, there was this girl, Malinche, who kind of hooked up with the Spanish and sort of betrayed her own people. And now, Malinche is sort of an insult in Mexico to call people who deny their Mexicanness, so to say, or their own mestizo identity, or they embrace, for example, some Western ideologies or thinking, reject or look down towards more traditional ways of thinking, religion, especially pre-Columbian religion, and so on and so forth. It is important to note, though, that being indigenous or indigeneity is a political category, right? So really, it does not exist without colonialism. If there were no colonialism, there would be no point in saying I'm indigenous. That is, through colonialism, that category of being comes into being, right? Becomes produced and reproduced as a form of resistance and resilience, right, of the outside dominance. So really, then the question is, so what is indigenism after we know what is indigeneity or what is being indigenous? So indigenism refers to a variety of ideologies that promotes the interests of indigeneity or indigenous people. So there's not really one definition to what it is, but there's a variety of ways to look at it. So from one perspective, it is any ideological movement that aspires to promote and protect the rights of the world's first people, right? Pueblos originarios, how they call it in Spanish. There's some stress on Latin American postcolonialism in this workshop, as you can sense, because that's somewhat of what I know better than, say, other regions where that have suffered from colonialism. But really, so what is important here, I think, and what is interesting here is that those peoples do call themselves pueblos originarios, right? So like original people, first peoples, there's a term First Nations, right? First Nation people in Canada. So really, you can sense there is an implication, a political implication that, we've been here first, the colonizers are the ones that came after, right? If they would have never came after, there would probably be no point in claiming that you're the original people, right? Because nobody came after. There's no conflict there. But it also refers to types of ethnic nationalism that emphasizes the group's indigeneity to their homeland, right? So it looks like different political movements in post-colonial polities where people organize over the interests of their own group. So that. Okay, so I hear there's a question from someone, and I think it's we can answer that right now. So Ludas will read it. Yeah.
Yeah. Aš norėjau paklausti, how does decoloniality practices interlink with active resistance action? That are separating from colonial or neo-colonial powers. Is it necessary for a successful separation, or what are the alternatives?
Yeah. So, it's a very good question. I think at least in the modern thinking about it, there is a contention there, right? And I think that contention is sort of illustrated in some of the debates, i.e., the motions you get set from time to time. So I would. So I think the answer is somewhat complicated. I think that there are some interests in post-colonial context that view or take authenticity as something real and something achievable. That is, there is an imagining of a being, right, where you can live without any sort of colonial or post-colonial influence. I think it would be fair to characterize it as something that is more of a political agenda or a political push to gain influence. And it's not something that is necessarily an achievable reality, so to say, in the most pure sense of it. right? If you look at the specifics of it, and we'll go into different cases a little bit later on. I think that there's already exists a quite sizable and real movements where they do manage to get rid of those Western epistemologies, so to call, right? Like Western scientificism, and sort of go back to a more indigenous ways of organizing their lives. So for an example, right, it could look like something as communal work practices that are done both by some hippie communities in Europe, but also by quite a few indigenous communities, for example, in Latin America, right? So because the idea of communal work for the better good of society is something that directly contradicts a more imperialist or post-colonial, or I mean, how do I call it? Yeah, let's call it imperialist notion of individualism, right? Or accumulation of capital. You could see it as, as directly opposite to that idea. That is something that directly contradicts it and how to say reframes it. I wouldn't though characterize it as something that's going back to the old ways. And we'll go into that a little bit deeper later on. So maybe I'll save it for then. But the answer is simple: like there's no going back to anything. What we can achieve, I think, realistically, is a merge of the Western ideas and the non-Western ideas. Of course, that's also a fake binary, but really we are looking at the amalgamation of different practices for the better good. The question then is, how do you get rid of the coercion that exists from outside that you can actually practice those, like put those into existence and practice those successfully? Does it answer the question? Well, I hope so.
Yeah, makes sense. The short follow-up question, ar tu manai, kad tada tai veikia only in communities, kurios yra fairly small, or could that also happen in bigger scales, pavyzdžiui, in countries?
I think it works the most successfully in small communities so far, like just seeing from practice, though we see some countries embracing those things on a national level, i.e., enshrining some of those principles in their constitutions and trying to push for those. So examples would be Bolivia or Ecuador, that, for example, inscribe the rights of nature into their own constitutions, right? And, for example, award legal personhood to natural objects. So does it work in practice? I.e., does it necessarily say protect that river from pollution? No. But I think that's a start, and given the right setting and sort of a less volatile sort of existence of a country, right? I think it could work. So there could be an argument made that, for example, that thing works much better in New Zealand, right? Because through the Maori own cosmology, that is also a thing that is embraced in the Kiwi legal system, right? In the territories of some iwis. Iwi is a sort of Maori territory where they have autonomy. I think it works better there, right? So I guess the problem is who really like has the autonomy and sovereignty over the territory where where those practices do happen. So if it's a state that sees the indigenous peoples as a sort of subset of society, that is, they're still kind of stuck in that colonial thinking where indigenous peoples, they're people who claim indigeneity, that is, they have that respect for the original ways and blah blah blah. if they see those as somewhat the other, I don't think that can work well unless they're otherized to the extent where the state decides not to care about them. It is a little bit different, for example, in Bolivia, because Bolivia constitutionally is a plurinational state, right? So it's not a nation state. And because it is a plurinational state, it awards the same level of self-determination to different nations, i.e. peoples in that territory, and like treats them with equal respect, or at least it should happen in theory, right? Unfortunately, it does not necessarily happen that way all the time, because there's, like, it's still like contested by quite a few domestic political powers, but also powers from the outside that seek resources that usually falls under the autonomy of indigenous peoples. Yeah. Okay, let's move on, because I feel like quite a bit will. Yeah. Hmm. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I'll go into it in the next slide, I think. So I will go into that deeper. What does it mean? But yeah, the general gist of it is what Luda said. Yeah. So I think we're good on this, right? So yeah, basically, indigenism is sort of a political movement, a political push, advocate for greater social political inclusion through either nationwide reforms or region-wide alliances. That is vindicating indigenous cultural linguistic difference, asserting indigenous rights, seeking recognition, compensation sometimes for the wrongdoings in the past. Blah blah blah. Okay, so now that we're clear on the sort of the territory in which we operate, let's go to the more specific theories or concepts that within deal with things and realities within post-colonialism. So I picked out quite a few theorists. I think there's going to be like 6 or 7, whose work is on post-colonialism. We'll go like through it historically, and you'll get a sense, I guess, of how these things got developed, or like thinking about all things post-colonial got developed, and also kind of we'll get some view into the major things, major things that are talked about in post-colonial theory. Okay, so we'll start with, sorry, Franz Fanon. So Franz Fanon is sort of one of the fathers of post-colonial theory, so to say. I think he was from Martinique, could have been from Guadeloupe, I don't know. He was Afro-Caribbean theorist. Basically, his own background was in psychoanalysis and psychology. So his body of work, most famous works, is on psychoanalytical theory of post-colonialism. That is, his writings were on the psychological effects or impacts of colonialism on the individuals, i.e. on the colonized. So it is the precursor on the more structural analysis of post-colonialism, but it's nevertheless something that laid groundwork for everyone that followed in this thinking. Yeah, so basically what Fanon claims is that colonialism is, the way it operates is that it systematically denies all attributes of humanity to the colonized people, right? So by doing so, it also imposes this mentality of servitude. That is, the colonized subject internalizes its own submission to the colonizer, so to say, right? So the way he works through his theory is that his central idea is basically that the self, right? So that is your own conception of who you are and how you are, develops in relation and in the encounter with the other. And he gets this idea through Lacan. So let's talk about this idea of the other. So this idea, I don't know where it comes from. I think it comes from like maybe John Stuart Mill or something. But it really like where it becomes cool is when Lacan takes it, right? When psychoanalysis takes it, and basically the other. So the theory is when your ego forms, i.e., your ego is that your own self-conception of you as a separate subject from your environment, right? That is, I distinguish myself from you. It happens when my ego, right, recognizes that there's something that is not me. And that is something that is not me is the other, right? So when we say the other, we usually mean, anything else, pretty much, or anyone else. Like it's a latter stage, like, babies at first, yeah, they know, they're not things that they touch. But once they get enough of the mental faculties that also start to developing that ego and distinguishing themselves from the others. The way then it becomes constructed is that you construct your own sense of who you are through negation of what you're not. Right? So that's sort of like not a mirroring stage, but you're like mirror of what you're not, and then you sort of decide, okay, like I have this, you have that, meaning, I'm this and you're that. Like I'm self and you're the other. And of course that happens with every one of us as we grow up, and that's something that psychologists and psychoanalysts delved into. Now, what Fanon does is he takes this concept and he applies it to the colonial relationship between the colonized and the colonizer, right? So what he says is basically, it's like I think it's like early mid 20th century, right? So we don't have like this idea really developed that we have now that that race is the invention that was like the whiteness. Like nobody thought of themselves as white before we really started like going really hard on the whole slavery thing, especially cattle slavery thing. That is when it was like very systematic movement of populations and displacement, right? Because we had slavery throughout the ages, but it wasn't like we moved so many people over the ocean to another place that we have to find a way to justify it, right? And the way to justify it is to create this binary where you construct your own superiority over someone else through the same sort of mechanism of constructing self in negation and in relation to the other, right? So Fanon says that race becomes a defining factor here, right? Because he works in the colonial setting. So he says race is the defining identitarian category. And through race and through the invention of race, that is through the invention of whiteness and blackness, right? You reproduce this, strategy of domination. Because what happens is then you also attach qualitative, like qualities to it, right? And it becomes a binary. So you have this like moral colonizer who's white, right? And then moral colonizer who's black. And then comes the long list of all the, adjectives with it, So white is moral, white's industrious, black is lazy, white is beautiful, black is ugly, and so on and so forth. What Fanon says as a psychoanalyst, as a psychologist, he basically says that, through this process, individuals, or rather whole cultures, internalize those things about themselves. And that's how they start to think of themselves, right? So his famous quote is that the colonized will always believe the worst about themselves, right? Because that is something encoded in the strategy of colonialism. That is, it is not only subjugating other people materially, right? It is also a more symbolic subjugation that not only happens through like physical subjugation, it also happens through a sort of ideological framework that is now instilled on those people, right? So the same effect happens to the colonizer. The colonizer starts thinking of themselves as a more moral, better character, right? Because his self or their self develops in negation to the other. So it becomes a binary, right? So be mindful. We're still talking about like structuralist times where it was very popular to think of things in binaries. And so really Fanon's theory, attaches itself on that. And it's like it still holds on, I think. Yeah, so that's one. And then a big contribution from Fanon, that is something important, is basically his formulation of decolonization and how maybe a post-colonial identity can be created or a post-colonial future. So he basically says there's 3 steps to it. Firstly, so the colonized, under the influence of the colonized culture, seeks to emulate and assimilate the culture of the colonizer and discard their own culture. All right, so it looks like something embracing, for example, Christianity, and then laughingly referring to, your pre-colonization beliefs as witchcraft, pagan stuff, and so on and so forth, right? It looks like embracing abstentionism, right? And then describing your, pre-colonization culture as something that's been archaic, bad, and so on and so forth. So really, like what he says firstly happens is this internalization of this binary, right? And when you internalize that you're somehow inferior, right? What happens then is that, well, you want to better your own material surroundings, right? So you try to emulate and to assimilate by mimicking, so to say, the culture that's been imposed to you, right? So what happens then is, Fanon says, is that you acknowledge the disparity and discover that you can never truly be white or white enough to be treated as equal, right? So his main insight is that there's this gap that is never to be bridged, and that is never why colonialism can, fully succeed, or rather why there is always going to be resilience and resistance, because people just generally seek equality, he says, or rather, not necessarily maybe equality, but rather elimination of injustice or elimination of coercive. And the more coercive that injustice is, of course, the more motivation they have to seek it. So really what happens then, Fanon says, is they go back to their roots, study of their own culture. That is something that it kind of doesn't hold that true anymore, because there's probably a consensus there is no such thing as like authentic culture, and there's like nothing to go back to pretty much. But then, yeah, Fanon basically says, okay, but we can achieve anti-coloniality, or we can become decolonized. And he's not talking about political decolonization here. He's talking about decolonization of consciousness, about decolonization of mind, i.e., that is freeing yourself from that inferior complex, right? It is about freeing yourself from that mentality of servitude, of that inferiority. That is, you have to firstly understand that you're not worse than the colonizer, right? And then he says, yeah, basically you start critically analyzing your own culture. He himself was a fan of negritude, that is, like pan-blackness sort of movement that was very popular and sort of inspired the colonization in Africa. We can talk about it a little bit later. It's quite fascinating, actually. Yeah. So basically, why Fanon is important is that Fanon was the first one to sort of lay down the groundwork for the psychological impacts of colonialism. That is, he applied the psychoanalytical concept of internalization of certain qualities through binaries to a post-colonial setting, right? And that also applies, in a sense of I don't know, explaining why, for example, the slaves, I don't know, didn't like resist too much, right? It's not because like they enjoyed it per Kanye West. It's because they rather internalized their own condition to a large degree, and so they needed to get through those phases, according to Fanon, to return to their culture. To organize secret societies, to preserve it, right? And then to act on it through acts of, firstly, small acts of resistance and then revolutions, for example, Haiti revolution, right, in the late 18th century. Okay, let's go on. So the second father of post-colonialism, so to say, is Edward Said. He was a Palestinian American social theorist, academic, and his work is on Orientalism. So before Said, the word Orientalism referred to the sort of practice of Western art mimicking or emulating Eastern art, right? So Western painters painting scenes from like India, Asia, and so on and so forth. So like their own imagination of that sort of, Orient reality. So what Said basically says is that he says that Europe, he specifically talks about Europe here, because he goes back to his subject is the Western-Eastern relations. So he goes back, so he talks about Europe and he basically says, so Europe intellectually divides the world into the Occident and the Orient, right? So really it's the West that creates the cultural concept of the East, and through the creation of the concept of the East, right, it creates the concept of the West. So it's very similar to Fanon, right, talking about it on an individual level, where he says, this European self or European colonizer, right, constructs his own white identity through the binary or through its own relation to the Black colonized. So it's really similar where the West creates this, creates the East and then creates itself through its own negation, right? So he claims that the East is an imagined geography. And that is a very powerful idea, and that idea still holds true, I think, in most of like academic thinking, in that, such categories as, the Islamic world, the Hindu world, the first world, the second world, blah, 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 they're just fake. They're imagined geographies. They're imposed, right, by the colonizing powers on those people. People before that didn't really think of themselves or their geographic sort of accumulations in that way. So he says basically that the West and the East are mutually constitutive. They cannot exist independent of each other because each of them exists on account of and for the other. So the impact he claims here, if we debate speak, is that he reduces everything non-Western into a homogeneous cultural entity, the other. Not he reduces, but the West reduces everything non-Western. So basically, the West says, because then he gets asked, right? So you talk about the East, how about like Africa and Latin America? And he says, oh, it's the same. It's just like, you say West and then the other. So basically, the West, invents the other, that is everything non-Western. It reduces everything non-Western to one thing, that is to the same binary, sort of. And it says, that the other is inferior, backward, irrational, wild, as opposed to the West, that is superior, progressive, rational, civil, so on and so forth. When you hear the foreign policy chief of EU, right, who's that, Borelli guy, when he says like Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle, he basically engages in 16th century ideology, right? It's something we know it's not true, but it's something that is still very, very powerful in society, and unfortunately, in many ways of many people's thinking about the world. He claims the harm of it is basically that it suppresses the non-Westerners. That is everyone who cannot bridge that gap of difference, right? From expressing and representing themselves as discrete peoples and cultures. So really what he means is that it becomes increasingly difficult for different people and peoples around the world to speak authentically about themselves and not be reduced to that non-Western category, right? And we're guilty of the same crime. Like even the anthropologists and like cultural theorists who work in these fields do use those categories, but you'll just see those in like quote marks or like in cursive, as in like they will refer to those and indicate that it's a fake category, it's a fake word. It doesn't mean anything, but it's just to be productive, right? You still have to sometimes use it, especially if you talk about these things. So basically, because of this binary relation that is constructed, he says all cultural representations generated within this are just social constructs, right? So he basically says, don't believe anything, that is told to you when it's, when you describe the West as a category, or when you describe, the non-West as a category, right? So he basically says, because of this, it becomes too easy to generalize and becomes increasingly difficult for those people to represent themselves. Yeah. Anyone has any questions so far? No. Okay, let's move on. Okay, now it's gonna get interesting. So let's talk a little bit. Sorry? No, I don't think so. Yeah. Okay. So the next idea is the subaltern, and that idea, well, in the post-colonial setting, it comes from Spivak, who's a great post-colonial thinker, and she works on basically on the post-colonial epistemology. So she has this famous essay that I invite you all to read. It's called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" So in that essay, her concern is like, is it even possible for you as a colonized people to have a voice, right? So it relates to Said here. As Said says, it's very, very difficult because you get generalized to a point where it's impossible, and reduced to that point. And then Spivak has a question, okay, what can we do about it? And we'll get to it. There's a way. So basically, the subaltern comes from, and many of you might know this, due to the intellectual orientation of the debate center. It comes from Gramsci, this Italian Marxist anarchist thinker, early 20th century. He uses the word subaltern to basically talk about proletariat. So he talks about, he invents the term subaltern, right, to refer to people and social groups that are displaced to the margins of society through cultural hegemony, right, oppressed to the point of exclusion from socioeconomic institutions of decision making. So cultural hegemony, right, is the way in how the capitalists or the rich use their own ideas on value and morality, right, to displace different people, different types of people to the margins of society and then exclude them. So, they exclude working people because, they're working people and not rich because they're too lazy or too dumb, or like, prostitutes are immoral, or like, I don't know, trans and queer people are this and that, and so on and so forth. So that's the idea, basically. So Spivak takes this and she applies this again to the post-colonial context, and she says, well, subalternity, or being subaltern, is basically refers to anything that has limited or no access to cultural imperialism, right? So it's kind of the same thinking, where cultural hegemony here is the same as cultural imperialism. So it's a space of difference and exclusion. So it's being the quality of the colonized, where you're marginalized to a point where you get no say, basically, or you get otherized, you become the other to a point where you can't really speak. And so then she talks about this epistemic violence that is a term from Foucault. You'll definitely read him in the first year in uni. And it basically describes the destruction of non-Western ways of perceiving the world and the resultant dominance of the Western ways in perceiving the world, right? So she, as a specifically post-colonial feminist thinker, relates this to women because of a colonial destruction of their culture immediately pushes the women's non-Western ways of perceiving, understanding, and knowing the world to social margins. So it's something like midwifery or something like folk medicine, right? Because we know that in quite a few societies around the world that had happened to be colonized, right? The knowledge passes down matrilineally, right? So in many of those societies, women are the ones that, even though they don't necessarily hold the political or the economic power, right? They hold the scientific power, so to say, right? Because like the myth is like the thing to realize here is probably I don't know if you thought about it, but the Western scientific method is an invention, right? It's like in post-colonial thinking, in a relativistic thinking, it has the same sort of quality as a mythical knowledge or as a traditional knowledge or a knowledge that accumulates through legacy and heritage. And because women in those societies are the ones that are the keepers of that knowledge, in some, not all societies, in some societies, they're the ones that are especially, pushed to the margins, right, in this globalized world, so to say. And so then she talks about two strategies, basically, of what people can do to have that voice and to claim that space, right? So one is essentialism, basically, and when she talks about essentialism, she says that with essentialism, that is with talking about your own condition broadly as a group of people, that is, as people who've been colonized, is this perceptual danger when your cultural identity becomes oversimplified, and then the stereotypical representation, of the whole group is what really translates into the ears of the listener, right? Because the listener here is usually also the colonizer, right? Or like the person who lives in the society, that used to colonize other parts of the world. So they're kind of, blind to the quite a lot of nuances, right, or injustices that have happened, especially when we talk about the more psychological effects of it. And so she says there's this danger here, speaking as a group. However, she highlights this opportunity of strategic essentialism when she says that at times, temporarily, this essential group identity that is grouping yourself together can be used to be heard and to be understood, right? When the timing is right and then the situation is right. So basically, she says that, yes, sometimes we can ignore the diversity of identities that that are the reality of a certain social group, but by temporarily minimizing it, we can pragmatically support the essential group identity. That is, she really says, let's look for commonalities between each other, and then maybe together we can have like a better push for being heard, so to say, right? And not being dismissed as, the silly, post-colonial person, a colonial subject. Yeah, so that's something I feel. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oppose the othering. Um, okay, good question. Not much, I would say. You can't really like it's not something you can touch. It's not a tangible thing. It's it's very like um I think it is has such an in-depth like psychological effect um that you don't necessarily like think about it when you're near immediate danger, right? Is the colonized coming at you and enslaving you. So it's not like, oh, you're not you're thinking about how not to get enslaved rather than, oh my God, what if they think about me as something else? And I need to show a commonality between us too. So I think it does sort of um, it does. Mhm, 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 mhm. That's true. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's fair. I think going back to Nautis's question, I can trace like resilience and resistance because that's something that's really embraced by, the indigenous movements today. It's like, usually like every second organization, their slogan is gonna be, resilience and resistance or something like that. I think I can trace that to like first systematic opposition to slavery, maybe, right? So it's really when, for example, the Spanish crown starts thinking, oof, maybe, maybe slavery is bad. Of course, they come up with the way out. They say, well, we can enslave them because we give them Jesus. So, we save their souls, but we take their bodies, and that's a fair trade. Um, uh, and then I think you first need to sort of develop this conceptually, right? You have to develop this commonality conceptually. That is, you have to first develop the thinking that is anti-subjugation and anti-slavery to sort of start thinking, okay, of different ways and strategies and how I can find commonality, i.e., resist, the othering. That is, find, the common ground. I would still claim that, like, I don't think it has been successfully resisted so far. I think there is now like good like theoretical thinking frameworks developed in how we should rethink some ways about our society, and that's the next slide actually. So we'll go to that and how we can get rid of the othering as a ideological and political tool. Um, yeah, so maybe let's go into that, and maybe that goes deeper and responds to your question. Okay, Baba. So if you want to go mad, go mad, read Baba. Very complicated. Usually like grad school level. I just had, unfortunately, I had to deal with them because of my thesis. So I had to go into that stuff. But it's pretty good. It's fascinating. Okay, so what Baba said is basically we should stop looking at the world having different cultures. So it's like, so that's the same, right? So we should get rid of this thinking that there are separate cultures. We should look at it as everything as this one integral sort of human world. So really looking for that sort of singularity point here, right? And he says we should do that because we need to fight off this reductionist, generalizing idea of imaginary peoples and places, right? So he says in most cases, those separate cultures, because it's like they get grouped into sort of these phantom ideas of like Christendom, Islamic world, third world, global south, so on and so forth. So he claims we should embrace this concept of the third space, right? So to answer your questions, maybe, like resistance and resilience hasn't been the most successful strategy because I think it complements the same binary, right? You need to break off that binary here because we know, like, according to Foucault, right, power relations is not as in like there's something that's dominating the other and the other is submitted to that domination. Power relation is the relationship between the two that is negotiated through time, and so it really that your own resistance reproduces your own inferiority in a way, is what Foucault says. Like, it doesn't mean necessarily that there's no point in resisting. He says it's extremely hard to find a meaningful resistance. And he says, like, resistance can happen meaningfully in the smallest ways here. And the ways that do escape the biopower of the state, so to say. So for him, for example, he was, he famously talked a lot about sadomasochism, right, as a sexual strategy to sort of liberate themselves from that power sort of relation, to escape that sort of binary. I think there is now more and more thinking, especially in the feminist thought, that talks about pleasure as power, right, and to like radical love and stuff like that, like. That really the breakaway here is through those things. Please don't call equity on me. So yeah, so basically, okay, yeah, no, I mean, yeah, okay, cool, okay, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that could be a fair critique, of Baba. I think what Baba engages here in is like it's a more like he talks more about on this whole like narrative level, right? So he says like the whole concept of culture is shit. I think it's the same discussion as like, oh sorry, it was bad. I think it's the same, for example, like we have the same discussion on race, right? We know like race is invented. And so the question then becomes, okay, so, by deconstructing that and realizing that's sort of invented, can we just get rid of it? Or rather, we should embrace it and find a way out of it. So I think it's two different strategies. I think his approach is, I mean, both can be critiqued. But I mean, the critique is fair. Yeah. I just think, Baba has a different strategy in mind. I'm not sure how he'd respond to himself though. But basically what he says, so Baba here, he talks about this third space. So he talks about hybridity here. So he says there's no real dominance and there's no real submission, i.e. there's no real authenticity as well. Like there's no such thing as authentic culture, right? So he says when two cultures interact with each other, right? They meet each other, a hybrid forms. And sort of we should embrace those hybrids that are very fluid and very flexible and are not fixed in tradition, if that makes sense, right? So he rejects this like sort of linear, unifying, homogenizing history, and where we're all gonna become one color, one gender, sex, whatever, like, this androgynous future person. That is sort of how, futurists think about humanity in a way. He says that's not what's happening. Like, there's this infinite variety of differences here that is created through hybridization, right? So he basically says that new cultural forms emerge through multiculturalism, right? Or Appadurai, another thinker, I invite you to read on a little bit. He talks about globalization in the same way. So for Papa here, colonialism is not something that exists in the past. It's like its ideology, its values, priorities, and so on. They constantly intrude on the present, and they just pop up and they reproduce themselves, and that's how like hybrids are created. Like a good I think example here are cargo cults. So cargo cults, if you don't know, are these, how do I say it, like millennialist belief systems in Melanesian islands. So you've probably like seen videos of like these Pacific Islanders worshiping Prince Charles of the UK, right? And they do these elaborate dancings imitating planes, and then they do these performances of where the goods get delivered, like oil and like electricity appliances and so on and so forth. So they've like syncretized sort of their own religions, with the historical experience that has happened when the first, when the planes used to come and drop in the goodies, right, for these people, and it's probably been a significant sort of happening for those people, and now it got syncretized into a religion. Another example would be, for example, when Western corporations, for example, come say into agricultural regions in the global south, and they reconstruct the whole process of work, and then they see the productivity drop, and they then invite the anthropologist, and the anthropologist says, yeah, that's because you banned like drumming while working and singing work songs, and it's crazy. Like, you see scenes now where like it's half like machines, like it's quite a sort of half modern enterprise, but you have that all like sort of, how do I say it, more traditional ways, like cultural practices interfering, or not interfering, but complementing the more modern practices introduced by people later on. So hybridization does happen all the time, and it's like Papa's argument is that this cling to traditional or authenticity is fake. It's political. Like it just appeals to people's own fears of change, rather, or like appeals to the certain classes wish to hold on to the status quo, to the establishment, and so forth. So he says, no, we should embrace this change. Yeah. Okay, let's go on. The next one, and we're nearing the end here, is Mbembe, who works quite a bit currently. And the concept here that I think is pretty cool from him is what he calls necropolitics. So here he borrows from Foucault. Foucault talks a lot about biopower and biopolitics, technologies of power, so to say. So he talks about how the practices of modern nation states and how they regulate populations and people through numerous diverse techniques and subjugate them to it, and that's how they control the populations, through basically establishing what's normal and what's deviant, through, for example, science, right? So famously, like anti-psychiatry movement has been, kind of went parallel with Foucault writing here, and basically saying that basically it's just like it's a Western invention, all the like psychological deviance and pathologization of a lot of diseases that are just alternative modes of being, and they're not worse, they're not better, they just don't conform to the wishes of a dominant capitalist class, so to say. So they need to be subdued, or and so on and so forth, right? So either through medicalization, we can maybe, make those people normal, or if it's impossible, we'll put them into asylums, so we hide them from society so that, it doesn't get like legitimized and so on and so forth. So basically Foucault says, right, we have all these disciplinary institutions, hospitals, prisons, schools, that operate, that are basically these controlled institutions by the state, where the human body is used through this this body is the subject of the state control through these institutions. That's why it's called biopolitics or biopower, right? Because we demonize or normalize some bodies, right, and not the others, and so forth. And so for Mbembe, in the post-colonial setting, he here doesn't talk about biopolitics. He takes it further because he says, it's not enough to just talk about the discipline that is instilled by the state in our bodies, but also what the state does is that the state dictates of how some people have to die, or how they're more likely to die. That is, it is not really how, according to Foucault, it manages life through body, but it also how state manages death through body, right? For Mbembe, of course, as a post-colonial thinker, the main qualifier here is race, especially racialized people, right? His whole necropolitic analysis is on Palestine and the situation there, of course, and how because of Israel being a settler colonial state, the Palestinian people have been racialized in opposition, following Foucault, Said, Spivak, Bhava, Mbembe. And so basically think of examples of how state exposes some people, right? Other people usually to mortal danger and death through war, through conscription, and so forth. How it sometimes otherizes its own citizens, right? In the same way, for example, how during conscription usually countries take from minorities, from minority ethnic populations. That's a common practice around the globe. How certain parts of population are marked for wearing their bodies out until death, right? Within capitalist modes of production. Also, how this analysis extends to trans and queer and necropolitics, right? And HIV/AIDS epidemic not even being, subjected to biopoliticking, right? So that's what Mbembe says. Sometimes it's not about reproducing a productive body, it's sometimes condemning body to death. And that's basically how he, frames a lot of how colonialism works, but also how neocolonialism operates in the post-colonial setting. So this is on post-colonialism. Let's now get into indigeneity a little bit. That is, we talked a little bit about decoloniality here. So my favorite anthropologist is Viveiros de Castro. He's this Brazilian guy. His famous tweet is, "The West is dead, get over it." And I find that really inspiring. So basically, Viveiros de Castro's claim to fame is that he challenges Western ontology, especially anthropocentrism here, because as you know, Western philosophy is I think, therefore I am. It's an I, there's an ego. It's all constructed around a thinking person as the center of everything, right? So he says, okay, there's one way to look at it. There's loads of cultures and societies that have a different sort of cosmological idea of how it works. And it's what he calls Amazonian or Amerindian perspectivism. So perspectivism is this conception according to which the world is inhabited by different sorts of subject of persons, human and non-human, which apprehend reality from distinct points of view. So I gave you just a quote here just to make it a little bit more understandable and what this sort of Amazonian perspectivism looks like. So I'll read it out now. So being people in their own sphere, non-humans see things as people do, but the things that they see are different. What to us is blood is maize beer to the jaguar. What to the souls of the dead is a rotting corpse, to us is a soaking manioc. Manioc is a type of cassava. What we see as a muddy waterhole, the tapir see as a great ceremonial house. So what he means here is that every object, whether it's animate or inanimate, according to this Amazonian perspective thinking, has its own self. That is, from the perspective of the jaguar, they are a human. And they see humans as tapirs. Like literally, they see it that way, right? The way, for example, we see blood, right? Our own blood, jaguars see it as beer, and so on and so forth. So it comes to the cosmological thinking of a lot of Amazonian societies, Amerindian too, that before, like in the times before, right, in the Golden Age, because they usually have a Golden Age, everything was human, right? That's because, and that's how, like, for example, even like geographic features as mountains, right? They're called sometimes, not sometimes, a lot of time actually, as like, oh, some story, like that's when the warrior came and did this and blah blah, like a sort of event or something, right? So before, in the times before, everything was human, and through time we lost the ability to apprehend and comprehend everything around us as human too, right? But they still do, or like they also lost parts of it and blah blah blah. Like everybody did, right? And so what's interesting here, right, is what he says, is that contrary to Western concept of nature, where nature is like objectively given, like it's right there, in Amazonian mythology, humanity or personhood is the original precondition from which all kinds of animals, plants, and even things in a variety of their forms emerge. So literally what I explained, right? So the second, like where it goes to as a second concept, is this concept of multinaturalism, is that there's a lot of natures, right? So it's a concept that differences between species are due to their bodily dispositions, while the human condition is shared by all living beings. Animals are not only perceived as living human-like social lives, but as viewing themselves as humans. At the same time, animals may view humans as animals, and especially as predators, mostly as jaguars. Practices like shamanism here may enter the animal's perspective temporarily and thereby foster communication among species. So that's where it becomes like really interesting, because basically what he says is that what if we introduce this idea to Western philosophy? Like it doesn't stick, like it doesn't incorporate. And like what's happening now is basically like this rewriting of the tenets of the Western philosophy by introducing these things. So, for example, it is part of this like larger ontological turn in both philosophy, legal studies, jurisprudence, sociology, and blah blah blah. For example, object-oriented ontology, right? Where we go into these questions, right, and we are slowly starting to, for example, think about mushrooms as the whole mushroom craze is part of it, really much. Or like before that, it was a smaller craze. It was like how forests think, right? And like where do we draw this line of personhood and agency, because there's enough proof that like lots of people in the world don't see it that way, and it works, like it functions, it operates. Maybe it could, too. So like it's quite experimental now. In practice, I guess we see it in legal mostly, right? How we award legal personhood and rights to some natural objects, right? Rivers, mountains, blah blah. You've probably debated like emotion on that. So just this is an invitation for you to to go deeper into Vivero de Castro and the concepts of perspective multinaturalism and enhance your arguments here. Because it's pretty cool. Okay. Lastly, then. Okay. Let's do that quick. Cool. Yeah. Sure, depending on the motion. So for example, okay, I don't want to give motions away actually. As a member of CAP for the upcoming LSDC, because okay, I'll just tell you there's a reason the slide is in here, okay? I'll just give that. It can work. It can work, especially if we. I mean, Vlad is on it right now, but um, I think it works in a more like ontological debates, right? Um, so, for example, there's okay, let's talk about it. There's this debate that legal personhood should be extended to significant natural wonders or something like the Amazon whatsoever. Um, you could have the same motion about everything. Like, what if we extend legal personhood to every inanimate object? We give them rights. Yeah. So I think multinaturalism then, or like perspective, is the way to frame that debate. I'm not saying you'll get that motion, but I'm saying we had discussions on a motion where like every pebble should be given rights, right? So like a small stone, it could be a debate. Besides that, so these sort of debates, uh, it can work there. I think it can work in some like indigenous debates, um, like autonomy, sovereignty, stuff like that. It can work, for example, for you to characterize better. Last year, right, in the nationals, we had this motion where this house would cede control of all national parks to indigenous peoples. Yeah, so like just characterizing why it's important for them, right? So because they literally like they see those objects as extensions of themselves. There's not necessarily like a difference between my own self and the other. That is, that mountain, that tree is not othered. It's not otherized. I know it's like difficult to kind of comprehend, it's just because it's a very like radically different way of being and thinking. But I think it like these ideas work when you have to characterize that sort of difference or importance um, of things to the indigenous peoples, right? So we'll go through quite a few motions actually. After this slide, I have two slides with motions. One's for more on decoloniality, the other is on indigeneity. We can talk about it. But yeah, but the last thing I wanna talk to you about is Buen Vivir. I think this is the probably it is super popular in Latin America right now as a political ideology, as a philosophical ideology. It's part of the ontological turn. It's part of the indigenous movement. Definitely, I think it's also one of the smarter reframings of Western socialist tradition. Um, and so I think like if you're into that sort of like thinking, I think that's where you need to look at right now. I think that's where the thinking is going. Because like Europe's dry, like the West is not gonna invent anything. That's it. Like, you know, the West is dead, get over it. Yeah, so basically on Buen Vivir. And so it has its own parallels in Quechua, Maya Tzotzil, different sort of Aymara, I know, have this concept as well. Literally, when translated, it means the plentiful life, a fair, dignified life, a whole life, and so on and so forth. So it refers to sort of like a more harmonious sort of way of being, right? In Spanish, usually it's called buen vivir. There's no universal definition of it yet, but it has things that are repetitive or are repeated, right? And so let's go over them. So first is the idea of harmony with nature, right? So that also includes its abiotic inanimate components. So like stone, pebble, anything inanimate you can think of, right? There is probably now a debate more and more whether trees and fungi are animate or inanimate because they do sort of respond to the external triggers and pressures and so on and so forth. So there's now more and more push, right, to recognize them. Yeah. And so basically, so what that means is that we consider people part of Mother Earth, to say Pachamama, people say different things, whatever. It's part of this deep ecology thinking. I don't know if you've heard about deep ecology. Deep ecology is basically saying, it's a very old thought. It's coming from like Humboldt to like, yeah, like late 18th century. But so it's basically thinking everything is a whole. So it's just, this one planet, it's one big organism, pretty much, right? And we should like reframe our thinking as not seeing the separateness and everything, but seeing our whole planet as one big thing. B, it's the vindication of the principles and values of marginalized subordinate peoples, right? So that relates to decoloniality a lot. So it's basically, going back to the values, the cosmology, and so on of the pre-Columbian or pre-colonial peoples, and then reclaiming or reconstructing that. And when I talk about reconstructing, I mean reintroducing it back into modern thinking. It's not like we can revive the way Inca thought, 1,000 years ago. Like that's not happening, but we can probably. But we can probably introduce and merge some ideas, i.e., create this hybridity there. C, the state becomes a guarantor of the satisfaction of basic needs: education, health, food, water, social justice, and equality. So it's a socialist way of thinking, right? So it's not a socialist statist, right? Because socialism doesn't mean statist. It can be individual socialism, like anarchistic socialism. But yeah, it basically sees state as an important agent here. I think most progress in this has been in Bolivia, right? Constitutionally, it's a plurinational state. That's why it's the first state that sort of like, retracted its ambassador from Israel, because, they just like by definition, they're anti-all nation states because like their constitution dictates it. And D, radical democracy. Radical democracy, I don't know if you're aware of this term. It refers to the idea that democracy should be extended as much as possible to all people and all spaces, i.e. workplace as well. Yeah, so these four principles basically. So it refers to implementation of a socialism that moves away from the Western socialist theory, embraces ancestral communitarian knowledge, lifestyle of Amerindian peoples, aims to achieve collective being, social responsibility, and how people relate to nature, and the halt to endless capital accumulation. For example, would be Minca. Minca is a old Inca tradition of community work, voluntary collective labor for purposes of social utility and community infrastructure projects. So basically, members of society are compelled to set aside some time, right, to work towards a public good. So that could be building a building, that could be helping someone to raise their kids, childbear, could be care for the elderly, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so it's like this kind of social tie sort of system that is not, monetized or commercialized, right? So it's like anti-capitalist, communitarian sort of way of being that's quite popular still in the more rural areas in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. It exists in Brazil to some extent. I'm not sure about Chile. Yeah, so where we see this in practice, so in 2008, the Constitution of Ecuador incorporated the concept of the rights of nature, as did in 2009 Constitution of Bolivia. I know in 2010, Bolivia extended it quite widely as well. So it's basically now the companies can be liable against crimes against nature and so on and so forth. So like ecocide and stuff like that. And those rights of nature, it's a long list of rights. It includes, I think, right not to stay as you are or not be polluted, right from intervention, right to clean water and air and stuff like that and so forth. So their courts must be full. Also, it's been practiced quite successfully by the Zapatistas, EZLN, in Chiapas in Mexico. Seen it with my own eyes. It works. It's pretty cool. Yeah. So I'm inviting you all to look into that. Okay, so now let's go maybe through some motions, unless you have some questions. No questions? Okay. Okay, so these are just some of the motions I've selected going through the databases. And that's something for you, to think about. I don't know if we have actually the time to go through every single one of them, but maybe if you could, if you want, you could indicate, and we can talk about one or the other. Because I think, like, I've been going through those, and like quite a few of concepts we talked about do relate to some motions and can be used there, or like can be developed to be used, especially in characterizations. Because I think, like, with post-colonial debates, and especially indigenous debates, like that's the biggest problem. Like, it's just so far from reality of what's happening. Yeah. So wait. So maybe I'll do that because Ludas is somewhere. How to argue? Okay. Okay. How to argue the journalist one from op? Where's that? Where's that? Okay. In post-colonial societies, this house would require all international media corporations to employ solely domestic journalists in reporting on national news. Okay. Okay, so I think the key here is the characterization of post-colonial societies, right? And I'm not saying you should pick on on or like cherry pick the worst cases, but you should probably find some commonality between them, right? So because of the post-colonial condition, that is the extension of colonialist exploitation and imperialist extractivist policy, uh, those states are like areas of both political, economic, and ideological contention, right? So those places are extremely volatile, so to say. Um, and so it is important also, right, to get like a more outside perspective. It is not, I don't think it's necessarily a debate on like self-representation, right? It's basically about, should we also have like a BBC correspondent in in post-colonial society in Niger, right? So we had these coups and we're Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, right? Um, yeah, we don't know how. I mean, if we let them self-report, i.e., construct the narrative of how it's happening, to the outside, we might not necessarily get the best reflection of what's happening on the ground, right? Because it's like cited. So that's one. So I would talk about those contexts. Secondly, I think, yeah, going back to my first point, is that those are polities still of contention, which creates rampant corruption. That's true. We can claim that. Violence, volatility, and so on and so forth, right? It doesn't necessarily. I think you also you explain why we need to why we have this interest there. Just don't frame it through we want their stuff and we need to steal their lithium and cobalt. You say, oh, we care because of our common humanity, and so on and so forth. So as op, you have to prove here the significant minority of cases here. So yeah, so you just pick contexts where it's the most necessary. So I would say, yeah, after coups and stuff like that, and then just in general, these are sometimes repressive, corrupt states, and we need to know. Also, we give them aid, so we should know how it's going, you know, like we should have the right like to keep an eye, so to say, and so on and so forth. I think, yeah, I don't think it becomes a representation debate. Like you can make it a representation and self-representation debate necessarily, but like you can say those journalists, you know, they can be trained like in cultural translation. Like they can be trained anthropologists. Like they don't necessarily, you know, they just need to be ideologues, or like it doesn't necessarily mean they will reflect, you know, ideological leanings of that Western country that sends those journalism. Okay. How to debate language currency once without losing to opposition economic development arguments? Is it enough to just characterize economic growth that's not as significant, or is there also other analysis? Okay. So let's do the first one. This house believes that in post-colonial states, school curricula should be taught exclusively in language of pre-existent colonial power. Should be taught exclusively. So I guess prop here is development economics, right? Well-being, blah, blah, blah. I think linguistic imperialism is very, very, like you use Fanon analysis here, like literally. I've judged debate in this year's World Schools. It was, I think, Team Kenya. It was something about curriculum and the use of language, and they had this linguistic colonialism argument, and that was really good. Like that was probably the first time I heard like a smart argument in like post-colonialism debate. So basically, I think what they said is that it is so demeaning to people, right? It is the cultural memory, right, of that. B, it trenches the same like self-conception of servitude and inferiority that you need to break from. Yeah. So I guess the principle here is very strong if you impact it correctly. Like the thing is like to know how to impact principle arguments. But I think here it's like it's really, really strong. Yeah, and then let's pick another one maybe. Currency. Where's currency? I hate the Z here. Okay. Okay, this house believes that West and Central African countries should abandon the CFA franc in favor of establishing their own independent country. How to, without losing to opposition? So I don't think CFA is actually like. I think the difficulty here from prop is from op. Yeah, is basically proving that CFA is good. Like it leads to economic development. Because CFA is exactly the tool with which the France holds them by the balls. Can you see that? Yeah, I mean, okay, so you related back to neocolonialism, right? You say, okay, so they got that nominal political decolonization. They weren't like economically decolonized, firstly, you know? So really those corporations that have dominion over natural resources stayed. Of course, a lot of them switched hands, you know, out of French ones to like American, British, and so on and so forth, Chinese, tralala. The thing is still like they can only like trade. So like the thing with CFA franc is that like they tied. They need consensus from the central bank of France if they want to do something, and so it ties them a lot. So you know it's that. Yeah, so that's why you see now, you know, after all these coups in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, them getting rid of. I know they got rid of French as official language now, but they're definitely getting rid of CFA as well. Yeah, so I would, yeah, on the franc one, I would contend. Yeah, I think it's actually easier for you to prove because one, like, you can actually. I don't know. I would say nationalize. Yeah, like with the global south, you always say nationalize, and you somehow like you try not to get killed by CAA. Basically, is the answer here. But like, yeah, you nationalize and you do that. Yeah, I think what else? I think hmm. Yeah, so yeah, I don't accept the premise. Yeah, but it's also like other types of decolonization I would talk about. Oh, there is one this. Oh, okay, we'll talk about it on indigeneity. But like, do you have any more examples on this one? On this slide? Yeah. So part two of your question, right? Characterized as not significant. Yeah, you do weighing also. And that's the way, like, after impacting your principle, like, I don't think principle here necessarily counters the economic, like, but you can edge it out pretty well. I think there's also, like, impacts, like utilitarian arguments to do it. Also, it doesn't make any, like, the French in Haiti, like, Haiti speaks French Creole, like, as an alternative to French. Like, is that like, what's the language, like, in Singapore before English? Like, Malay? Probably, right? Yeah. But yeah, but like also like with the languages, they're usually like regional languages. So like Swahili, they'll be fine. Like, Latin Americans don't need to learn English because like there's so many people speaking Spanish around. Like there's no like it's a self-contained thing. On the currency, how do you respond to corruption arcs that the country needs to have a stable currency? It's impossible to have a great currency. Or are there any more examples tied to dollar? The principle weak as opposed to economics then? Okay, on the principle, how do you respond to corruption arcs? That the country needs to have stable currency. Um, well, I mean, corruption is even like so. Corruption is more still so anti-corruption measures, right? They're more tied to the workings of like World Bank and IMF. And it doesn't really matter. So it's like it doesn't really matter whether France is gonna look as France's central bank is the one who's looking over you, or is it gonna be some other institution or country from which you're lending, right? They'll both have like anti-corruption tied to it, to the whatever, like to you borrowing money. Because you'll have to borrow money or something like aid and so on and so forth. Like I don't think there is exclusively that's true that corruption is only through that stable currency. Okay, yeah, you can dollarize as well. I mean, I wouldn't dollarize maybe, but like what's probably gonna happen in Africa, right, is that they'll have like regional currencies then. And then the volatility of the currency depends on many, many, many factors. But like we know, there's many non-European successful currencies. I don't see necessarily where you're getting with it. Um, Price dollar. Yeah, yeah. You can. You don't necessarily. Yeah. No. There are some good currencies as well. Isn't the principle weak as opposed to economics then? Wait, I don't understand this question. What principle? Oh, like your own sovereignty? Mm, yeah, no, but I think the debate's on practical here. I don't necessarily like. I think that's part of the colonial thinking, actually. Also, like you can have mitigatory mechanisms, right? You can explain of how, like, France, like Western countries will probably not be likely to punish or destabilize those countries because, like, volatility of currency has a lot to do with that, right? With the foreign sort of meddling. Yeah. Any more questions or follow-ups on this one? And if not, we can go to the indigenous one. Yeah, let's go to the indigenous one. Here's the slide. I'll make it bigger for a little while. There's been one motion I've seen over and over again, and I think it's a really bad motion. It was something like, we should contact uncontacted people. Or like Brazilian government should establish relationships with uncontacted tribes, so on and so forth. Yeah, the reason why this can, like, this should never be said, for obvious reasons, right? Diseases, and like, it's basically a form of genocide. You can argue, but also secondly, and I think that's very important for framing, right? That most, like a question exists whether there's truly uncontacted people, right? The thing is, they're better characterized and described as people who have selected self-isolation, because most of the areas where most of the uncontacted people live, right? The indigenous peoples there live in a sort of cultural continuum that they intermarry a lot, they hang out a lot, they communicate between different tribes a lot, and so on and so forth. Those uncontacted people have probably seen the effects of that modern intervention, or been told of the effects by neighboring tribes or people. So they've probably been made aware to the extent where they comprehend and can evaluate, right, their own self-isolation. And if they do, right, understanding that, they potentially be wiped off, it's probably, makes sense that we don't go and contact them and talk to them, right? Yeah. So just like outframe this debate, or like bring it sense. If you ever get this motion, like that might happen, unfortunately. Okay, so anybody has questions on the any motion on the slide? Okay, if not, then I guess that's the end of it. And I wish you all best of luck tomorrow then. Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.